I always thought that this parable was about talents, like time, talent, and treasure. Like all those things that you're good at that are gifts for you. And that you're supposed to use them. And when you use them, they will multiply and double whatever it is that you're doing. I don't know exactly how that works. How do you double a song or a piece of art but somehow, if you invest your talent, that the outcome will be double. And in that version of the parable, the guys who invested their 5 talents and their 2 talents are the admirable ones, right? They make 100%. They double their pleasure. Okay, that's gone. Then I went to seminary. We do learn things in seminary. I discovered that a talent, one talent, is something like 20 years' wages. Whew, that means those guys are some bucks, right? What would you do with that kind of money? I mean, what kind of money is that? Of course, it depends on what year's wages were, but that's a lot of money. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm kind of resonating with that last guy. Yikes. What are we going to do with this? 20 years' wages? I better hide it because, I'll blow through it. Well, no, you probably couldn't blow through it pretty fast, but yikes, right? So it became a little more like hard to imagine that reality and what might be in that parable. And hard to imagine making 100%. Where does that happen today? Well, we know places where it happens. We'll get to that. So, I came away from that parable, that learning about that parable, thinking that there's a risk that's being taken here. And the first 2 guys were still the admirable ones because they took the risk of investing this money for their master. Now, I didn't quite know what to do with that nasty master, because that didn't seem like a godly person at all, but there are other parables where the character who's supposed to represent God isn't all that godly. And so I thought, if this nasty guy does this, then God must do even better for those folks who are willing to risk their talents. And then Occupy happened. Remember that movement, right? And Susan Thistlethwaite, it's a hard name to say it 3 times, Thistlethwaite. She wrote a book called Occupy the Bible. Some of us are reading it together. The subtitle is What Jesus Said and Did About Money. Her background to this parable helps us understand the economic situation of that day. So there was the 1% in the ancient Middle East. The Romans, occupied a number of those positions in the 1%, but there were Jews who were of the 1% as well. The ruling class, the wealthy business people. And they were in collusion with the wealthy temple rulers. Sometimes they were one and the same person, just wearing different hats at different times. And here's how it worked. The wealthy business people would loan their money to the temple business people, who then ran these tables of exchange. Remember when Jesus overthrew those tables? There were people sitting at those tables who, when folks from the outside came in who had Roman coin, they exchanged the coin for Hebrew coin, because the temple would only take Hebrew coin in purchase of the required sacrifice. I don't know what the exchange rate is right now between the US dollar and some other currencies, but, little trick here is that these wealthy people would give their money to the temple to use. So it's kind of this, cyclical thing. And if they did that, they never had to pay Roman tax on it because it was a donation, a religious donation. Kind of like what we have, right? You can, donate and you don't pay taxes on that money. But also, if you gave your money to the temple, you didn't have to give it back to its rightful owner, like the land that you had confiscated from the poor farmer, in the year of Jubilee. So you know about this year of Jubilee, right? Every 50 years, land goes back to the original family. So that always people can work the land for their well-being. We know that this didn't really happen. There was always an excuse why it shouldn't. And this was one of them. Well, I gave that money to the temple. I can't take it back now and give this land back. That won't work. So it's a really wicked system because the people in the temple not only are getting wealthy from this, but they're the very ones who are supposed to be protecting the poor from this kind of oppression. And if you read the Torah, some of those Leviticus passages, that put you to sleep if you read them, some of those passages talk about lending money. And it never, not occasionally, not once in a while, never are you to loan money to a poor person with interest. Never is that a permitted way of economics in ancient Israel. The prophets rail against this behavior. You don't have to read far in any book of the prophets before you find out that economic oppression by the temple, by the ruling class, is the main source of God's judgment on Israel. So I read after that. And I started to think differently about this parable. How did those first two guys double that money? Why is it that that third guy was so scared he had to take his money and hide it? By the way, in the ancient world, according to the rabbis, it was permissible to bury money in the ground, much safer than keeping it tucked under your mattress in your unlocked home. So maybe the question isn't, are we willing to take a risk? Maybe the question is, what kind of risk are we willing to take? Stan Duncan is a UCC minister. He writes a blog spot called Jubilee Justice Economics. His interpretation of this parable will appear on the Huffington Post this morning. I lifted a piece of what he says. Quote, "That brings me back again to believing that perhaps Jesus' more subtle goal in this parable was to paint a picture of what the world is really like if good people, like the last slave, stand up to power and abuse and name it. They sometimes win, but they often lose. Whether or not that's what Jesus thought in this particular parable, though I think it is, Duncan says, I think Jesus himself grasped that message with his own life. There was no way that he was going to take his alternative reality movement into the belly of Jerusalem, where the temple was, and come out alive. He could pray to God to have the cup passed from him, but he knew it wouldn't be. To be faithful to the image of a just and humane and coming realm of God, he had to stand up to the powers and run the chance that they would, and in fact did, crush him. Duncan goes on to talk about The Daily Show in an interview with the journalist Majir Bahari, who'd been imprisoned for being interviewed, and he talked about the situation where he was abused and beaten for standing up to power. And then he talked about how his uncle also had been, and his father also had been, and his grandfather also had been. This is the documentary that Jon Stewart has just created about this man's life. And he talks about how this propensity in this man's life to do this was so amazing, so miraculous. And then Duncan goes on. I'm not certain, but my suspicion is that the message Jesus was trying to convey was that if you stand up for the values of God's realm on earth, sometimes you'll be rewarded, and sometimes you'll be destroyed. And you need to be courageous to go forward anyway. If every believer in a just and humane, spirit-infused world caves in, the controlling powers will be delighted. And it's worth reading if you get to HuffPost today. You know that this has been repeated throughout history. The whole conflict in El Salvador was about the disparity between the rich and the poor, and the government's cover-up of the massacre of some Jesuits. The whole farm workers' union movement in our own country with Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta. Over and over and over again, this repeats itself, where the rich seek to get richer and the poor seek to get poorer. I'm almost sick of talking about it. And so I started thinking about what do we do about it. There's this organization called Slow Money. I think I've mentioned it before, invited you to check it out. I thought it was worth reading their principles as something maybe we could get on board with. This is what they say. With trillions of dollars a day accelerating around the globe, investing in securities that no one fully understands, maybe it's time to affirm a new direction. The slow money principles. In order to enhance food security, food safety, and food access, to improve nutrition and health, to promote cultural, ecological, and economic diversity, and to accelerate the transition from an economy based on extraction and consumption to an economy based on preservation and restoration. We do hereby affirm the following principles. 1, we must bring money back down to earth. You know, one of the things in the Torah I forgot to mention earlier is that it was prohibited to make money with money. You had to work. You had to do productive work to make your money. I think that's what this first principle is, bringing money back to earth. There's, number 2, there's such a thing as money that's too fast, companies that are too big, finance that is too complex. Therefore, we must slow our money down. Not all of it, of course, but enough to matter. Number 3, the 20th century was the era of buy low, sell high, and wealth now, philanthropy later. What one venture capitalist called the largest legal accumulation of wealth in history. That was the 20th century. The 21st century will be the era of nurture capital, built around the principles of carrying capacity, care of the commons, sense of place, and nonviolence. Number 4, we must learn to invest as if food, farms, and fertility matter. We must connect investors to the places where they live, creating vital relationships and new sources of capital for small food enterprises. Number 5. There are 2 more. Number 5. Let us celebrate the generation of entrepreneurs, consumers, and investors who are showing the way from making a killing to making a living. And number 6. Paul Newman said, quote, "I just happen to think that in life, we need to be a little like the farmer who puts back into the soil what he takes out." Unquote. Recognizing the wisdom of these words, let us begin rebuilding our economy from the ground up, asking, what would the world be like if we invested 50% of our assets within 50 miles of where we live? What if there were a generation of companies that gave away 50% of their profits? And what if there were 50% more organic matter in our soil 50 years from now? There are chapters of slow money springing up in multiple countries throughout the world. $38 million has been invested in the kinds